Hey there, and thanks for stopping by. In 2021, Masterbox expanded the Strange Company universe by releasing a brand new set of figures to join the burgeoning group of resistance fighters. The three new characters feature in episode 4 of the series, which is titled We Beat Them. The figure of Ianis, better known as Sly Ianis, is the owner of a company which constructs advanced fighting robots. Ianis was released in kit number 24070, and judging from his box art, he is quite the interesting character. All of his parts were on one sprue set, and the box included a detailed parts and paint guide, as well as a small backstory for Chapter 4. The individual parts were all neat and crisp, and molded to the usual high standards held by Masterbox. There was next to no flash, and mold lines were carefully crafted to blend in with the surface details as much as possible. Where parts of the model joined up, the resulting seam lines were formed over areas which were relatively less detailed to reduce the risk of ruining the sculpt with cleanup and filling later on. The next figure in episode 4 is that of Natie, the deranged-looking mechanical engineer of the group. Similarly, all of Natie's parts were precisely set out on one sprue tree, which was neatly packaged inside kit number 24072. She also had her own build guide, which doubled as a key to the paint color table at the back of the box. It's worth it to mention that the color tables that appear on the boxes of all three figures were excellent and featured callouts for a total of 5 popular brands of paint. Valerie was the third member of the new characters, and she's the beautiful yet brilliant software engineer of the group. Her parts were also on a single sprue, and like those of her companions, were well formed and free of any obvious mold lines or defects. The parts for each figure were carefully clipped from their sprues, and I used a sharp X-Acto blade to gently scrape away the few mold lines that there were. Some of the mold lines were in tight spots, such as those in Natie's hairline. I used more caution in these areas and made sure not to destroy too much of the finely sculpted elements. The figures were glued together using Tamiya thin modeling cement. For the most part, everything fitted together quite snugly, and there weren't many gaps to fill at the seam lines. I test fitted Ianis's upper and lower halves, but these were only finally glued together at the end of the build to make it easier to paint the back of his leather apron. The same was true for Natie's glasses, Valerie's ponytail, and Ianis's hat. Everything received a black base coat of Vallejo's surface primer. I was careful to include those loose parts which would be added to the figures later. Once I was happy that the base coat had dried, I applied a zenithal highlight to the high spots of each figure. This was accomplished by using an airbrush and spraying on some white ink from an overhead position relative to each figure. As a result, one could easily make out the finer details of each sculpt, and also get a good idea of where to place the light and shadows of each figurine. When viewed from above, the highlights are immediately visible, and when viewed from below, one can clearly see which parts need to be treated as darker, shadowed areas. Then it was a matter of blocking in the base coat layers. I started with a skim, and applied several thin coats of the color I was planning to use for the dark tone of the skin. After each layer dried, I applied subsequent thin layers until I achieved the opacity I was after. Using the same technique, I added color to the other parts of each figure. I made sure to do all of the larger areas first, and finally finished with the smaller leather pouches and belts. With all the main colors blocked in, the bulk of the painting was done, and all that was needed was a few finishing touches. Using some of Citadel's Reichland flesh shade, I picked out the finer features on the face and other areas of exposed flesh. I found this color works well on leather bits too. Everything else was filtered with some army painted dark tone and left to dry for a couple of hours. From there, it was a simple matter to pick out the highlights on each figure with a fine paintbrush and complete their assembly by adding all the loose bits which were saved for last. Ianis owned a small company that built fierce robots which were used in semi-legal gladiatorial fights. He had earned the nickname Sly Ianis for a good reason. His ability to overcome a no-win situation by presenting an opponent with an unanticipated move, snatching victory at the most hopeless moment, had made him a legend a long time ago in the gladiatorial world. Competition was fierce amongst rival companies, so they attracted the most talented engineers in the galaxy, which led to some major technological breakthroughs. This made the galactic government very nervous, and they kept a watchful eye on those companies, lest some of those superior technologies fell into the wrong hands. And of course, illegal trade in technologies was a major part of Ianis' income. Natie was a proficient technician who could effortlessly scratch-build a robot from a rusty pile of junk. Her appearance was most deceiving, as she dressed and acted like a precocious little schoolgirl, but behind this persona hid the talents of an ingenious mechanical engineer. Many fierce competitors were taken in by her charms, a mistake which led to their ultimate defeat in the battle arena. Valerie was the team's software specialist who was responsible for designing the artificial intelligence of the battle robots. As a beautiful and carefree person, she was also someone who was easily underestimated by opposing teams, always to their detriment. Along with Ianis and Natie, they ran a lucrative side business where they illegally traded in technologies right under the auspices of the galactic government. That is, until they were caught. I had run out of space in Joker's barroom, no pun intended, and besides, I felt this new trio deserved their own little scene, so I decided to use the box art featured behind the characters as an inspiration to construct a diorama of a rusty old robot graveyard. An old plastic container was outfitted with some nifty chompers, all held in place by blobs of hot glue. With some styrene tube chunks and plastic beads for eyes, his head was pretty much done. His arms were constructed from plastic tubes with beads for joints. I figured this would make him more posable and allow me to position him properly later on. His hands were made the same way. Originally the fingers were way too long. I wanted them to look more claw-like, so I shortened the fingers considerably and formed a nasty set of long claws using some green stuff. I recycled some old bits of polystyrene and used hot glue to attach them to the diorama base. These were going to form the starting point for the mounds of junk in that section of the robot graveyard. I had a good idea early on how I wanted to position the giant robot, the fallen titan, within the diorama. I tested his position carefully with Ianis and company in the forefront to make sure that nothing was positioned in a weird way. I used a sharp X-Acto blade to trim down the junk pile mound and made sure to create an indent in the spot where his head would rest, kind of half buried in the scrap metal. I mixed a batch of Woodland Scenics plaster and applied this over the polystyrene. This would provide a great infrastructure for all the junk parts to be added later. There was a big empty gap in the front of the diorama, so I added another smaller junk mound for a bit of visual interest. After the base had dried, it received a base coat of Tamiya red oxide surface primer. The fallen titan was glued into position, with his arms outstretched as though he were ready to embrace his death. His torso was part of an X-wing, which had long since crashed on the faraway planet Jakku. To start the junk pile, I decided to disassemble Iron Man. Sorry, Tony.
Really? That's it. You just roll over, show your belly.
I need backup. Stat.
Actually, he was a cheap knockoff from a Chinese store, so I didn't feel too bad. And I disassembled a fake Transformer as well. That makes 2 wins for the Marvel Universe. Building up the piles of junk was great fun, as I delved deep into my spare parts box and used bits and pieces from every model I'd built over the past few years. Helen Parsons' shield, the F-22's ladder, the Valkyrie's alternative canopy, the Viggen's landing gear, they're all in those junk piles, along with bits and pieces from all my other models. It kind of made the junkyard special in a way. Of course, the diorama base looked even better once everything received another rust-colored base coat to unify the whole scene. Using a sponge, I applied some Tamiya XF84 dark iron all over the junk pile. This would provide the first dark layer of rust to all the parts of the graveyard. Then I used a craggy old paintbrush to stipple on some Tamiya XF54 metallic grey to really sell the metallic look. This looked pretty good, but I needed to emphasize the rustiness of the graveyard, which meant I would need to add a lot more rust effects. I sponged on some yellow ochre, being sure to hit mostly the edges of the various metal parts. As a follow-up, I stippled on some medium brown in a random pattern, using the same gammy old paintbrush as before. The results were very colourful, to say the least. This was okay though, as the next step in the process would tone everything back down again. I started off by applying a generous wash of Citadel's Nuln oil to all the nooks and crannies in the junkyard. This brought out the small details of the various bits and pieces which made up the junk piles. Using an airbrush, I applied a thin dust layer over all the parts by spraying some highly diluted Tamiya XF59 Desert Yellow over the whole diorama. I hit the high points and some random areas on the ground with some Tamiya Deck Tan, which I applied very sparingly just for some color variation. I finished off with a dry brush of metallic grey, using the janky old paintbrush again. Finally, I had achieved the look I was shooting for. A rusty, dusty, old metallic robot graveyard and the perfect diorama base for the latest members of Strange Company. While the Galactic government was suspicious of the companies which produce battle robots, they did encourage the sport itself. The spectacle of robotic fights was one of the ways in which the government could eradicate the so-called extra people. These formed a large part of the population which had descended into a virtual world. The extra people spent their lives jacked into computers to have their bloodlust satisfied by violent sports, while their bodies withered away and died at a young age. Ianis and company managed to fool government agents for a long time, but eventually their luck would run out. The Galactic Security Forces struck without warning, but the threesome did not go quietly. When they put up a fight to resist their arrest, they were instantly branded as outlaws. Luckily, their paths crossed with Helen Parsons, who convinced them to join the ranks of Strange Company, where they formed an integral part of the technical arm of the Resistance. So long, and thank you for watching.